Peace, welcome back. I'm Red Tail Hawk, also known as Tavis Sanders, and welcome to Indigenous Education 010.2, Defining Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. So, what does it mean to be indigenous? What does it mean to be tribal? And is there a difference? Before we answer those questions, let's find out who are indigenous peoples. Well, as we can see here, indigenous and tribal peoples is the common term used for over 370 million people in over 70 countries worldwide. Nationally, meaning locally, they're known as terms such as natives, hills tribes, hunter-gatherers, aboriginal peoples, and First Nations. And since there's so many people to be protected, international law uses the terms indigenous and tribals and then gives both of them a set of rights. With that being said, there is no universal definition for indigenous and tribal peoples. However, international law, specifically International Labor Organization Convention 169, takes a practical approach and gives us subjective and objective criteria for how to identify the people. So again, there's no definition, however, there's a criteria for us to use to identify the people. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about subjective and objective and make sure we understand the difference. Objective thinking is based on fact. Subjective thinking is based on a personal belief. It's your opinion. And so, an example that I like to use is an objective statement: Donald Trump is the President of the United States. A subjective statement that's floating around would be, Donald Trump is not my president. So that could be the difference between objective and subjective. Objective based on facts, subjective is a person's opinion. And so with that, let's take a look at the criteria for identifying a tribal people. First, let's look at the subjective criteria. And as we can see, the subjective criteria for identifying a tribal people is self-identification, meaning as the person wants to identify themselves as tribal, they have that right. But that's their personal opinion and not necessarily based on fact. Now let's take a look at the fact-based criteria for how to identify an indigenous people. And as we can see, we have a few more things that we need to consider. Tribal peoples have their own culture, their own social and economic conditions, and it is distinguished from the national community. So that's first. And then the second criteria would be that their status is regulated wholly or partially by the colonial system. And it also says here that they are semi-sovereign. And so while they can make some of their own decisions, they can't wholeheartedly make all of their decisions. Example for this would be a BIA tribe Native Americans. While they do have control over some of their internal situations, if they're part of the BIA, the United States still has a right to step in and say something about a particular decision. So we got to consider that as we move forward and how we identify ourselves. Now, let's take a look at some of the elements of a tribal people. And, these are the things that the peoples would exhibit. And again, this is coming from International Law Convention 169, if people are interested in learning more about that. Nonetheless, the elements are that they have a traditional lifestyle, and again, they have a culture that is different from the other segments of the national community, and they have their own social organization. These are the facts centered around being identified as a tribal peoples internationally. Now let's take a look at indigenous. First, let's look at the subjective criteria. And again, this is the criteria based on emotion or personal belief. And again, it says self-identification. So basically, you can call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. That's your personal opinion. However, when we look at the facts of the situation, let's take a look and see what it says. So let's look at the objective criteria. And the objective criteria states that these peoples must descend from a population whom inhabited the country or the geographical region at the time of conquest or colonization of the present state. And so with that being said, throughout the history that Indeed has published, and now a whole lot of other individuals socially and through works, whether it be programming or books or videos or alike, we have proven without a doubt that the black population of the United States has been here for thousands of years, at thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Nonetheless, let's go on and look at some of the other criteria established in order to be identified as indigenous. The population must retain some of their social, economic, culture, and it must also retain some kind of political institution, irrespective of their legal rights. So let's take a look at some of the elements. And I actually put the elements of tribal next to the elements of indigenous. And as we can see, for the most part, they're the same. Until we get to the bottom, where it says social organization. And while both tribal and indigenous peoples have their own social organizations, again, remember, tribal people are semi-sovereign, whereas indigenous peoples are autonomous, as we see here where it says that indigenous peoples have political institutions. And so the major difference between being recognized as a tribal people and being recognized as an indigenous people is your autonomy, or your right to self-control your internal affairs without outside influence. For instance, the BIA, the United States, is involved in economics and other things. And as indigenous peoples, we would have to establish that on our own and not lean on the United States for maybe help with economics and things of that nature. So there's a lot of work to do for indigenous peoples worldwide as we establish ourselves autonomously. So the question of identity, as far as international world is concerned, according to the United Nations, the most fruitful approach is to identify rather than define. And the identification is based on the fundamental right that every individual has the right to be whatever they want to be. And then again, after that, we have a fact-based criteria established to recognize these people versus individuals whom are just saying it just to say it. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope this was informative. Thank you very much. Peace.